What if the Manhattan Project failed? In August 1942, the US created a top-secret project to aid the ongoing war. They named it the Manhattan Project, as its first office was in Manhattan at 270 Broadway. It seemed like just another operation to further the country's war effort. But little did we know, it changed the world as we know it. But first, what exactly was the Manhattan Project for? The Manhattan Project was a top-secret project created by the United States to develop the first nuclear weapons in the world. It was so top-secret that some of the contributors to the project only knew what their work was for after it had ended. They were compelled to do this when they suspected that Germany was also developing nuclear weapons and had a head start over them. The project was headed and organized by Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, who had experience managing big military projects, such as the construction of the Pentagon. Not long after that, Groves chose J. Robert Oppenheimer as the lead scientist for the project. Other notable scientists like Enrico Fermi and Richard Feynman also joined the project. Oppenheimer was already studying how the atomic bomb could be created. The project was scattered in different places and employed more than 130,000 people. There were sites in Hanford, Washington, and Tennessee, but Oppenheimer chose the project's primary site and decided on Los Alamos, New Mexico. It was isolated and away from the public. It was July 16, 1945, at Alamogordo, New Mexico. The crucial members of the Manhattan Project gathered together to determine if their hard work had paid off. This would be the first test for their new invention, the atomic bomb. The test was codenamed Trinity, and the bomb was a plutonium-239 implosion they called Gadget. It was at 5:30 a.m. when they dropped the bomb, and everyone was shocked. The atomic bomb they tested produced the power that they aimed for, and in that moment, we stepped into the nuclear age. At that time of the war, Hitler and the Germans had already surrendered, but the Japanese wanted to keep fighting. Japan was losing the war, but it didn't have any plans of surrendering, and they wanted to fight till the bitter end. The US warned Japan of the dire circumstances that would befall them if they didn't surrender. They tried to convince them to concede, but Japan still refused. Thus, the US decided to bring out the big guns. On August 6, 1945, at about 8:15 local time, a US bomber released the first nuclear bomb used for an enemy. It was a gun assembly fission bomb named Little Boy, and it was dropped on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. The explosion was estimated to be as strong as 15,000 tons of TNT. It immediately killed 70,000 people and killed more after some died from the injuries and other harmful effects they got from the nuke. At that time, the type of damage it did was unimaginable. No one would have expected a weapon to be this strong. And the worst part was, the US wasn't done yet. 3 days later, the US dropped another nuclear bomb, a plutonic implosion bomb they named Fat Man. This time, it was dropped in Nagasaki, Japan. It detonated with an explosive force of 21,000 tons of TNT and instantly killed 40,000 people. Another 30,000 would die from injuries and radiation poisoning. The damage from the nukes was so massive that even the strong-willed Japanese was forced to surrender on September 2, 1945. But what would have happened if the Manhattan Project did fail? What would happen if Japan were never nuked? And how would it impact us today? Then, the US only had one goal: to end the war and spare thousands of lives and casualties on their part and the world. Even if the project had failed, the US, Great Britain, and China would still send an ultimatum to Japan for their unconditional surrender. They sent this ultimatum on July 26, 1945, known as the Potsdam Declaration. And in this scenario, Japan would still refuse and continue fighting. Now that the US cannot depend on its nuclear weapons, what would be its next step? Only one thing would happen without the Little Boy and the Fat Man. They would not have surrendered, and the war would not end as early as it did. The US would now maneuver to their next step, their backup plan called Operation Downfall. If they can't rely on nuclear weapons, they will resort to other ways of aerial attacks that have proven effective. On the night of March 9, 1945, the US sent bombers to Tokyo and dropped 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs within 2 days. It was estimated that the attack killed 80,000 to 125,000 people, including 100,000 civilians on the ground. In fact, the carnage was so severe that the pilots had to cover their faces so they couldn't smell the thousands of burning flesh on the ground. They targeted buildings and even homes that helped in manufacturing war materials for Japan. Without nuclear weapons, the US would send more of these fire bombings. Dropping bombs in the city significantly contribute to Japan's war efforts. As a response, Japan would then focus its resources on creating anti-aircraft weapons to combat the bombers and strike first before they could drop their bombs. Japan would also send more kamikaze pilots to strike at the US naval ships. If you don't know, kamikaze pilots are the equivalent of suicide bombers. They fly their aircraft to enemy bases and territories to create an explosion and damage the enemies. These pilots are ready to sacrifice their lives for their country. These kamikaze aircraft can also cut Japan's cost since they can be cheap on the parts. As long as these aircraft explode upon collision, they're good to go. If Japan still won't surrender, the US would have no choice but to resort to a more bloody fight, a land invasion. At this point, Europe would stabilize and try to recuperate from the war. Thus, European allies could not send their troops to help the US. The Soviet Union would also be recovering from the war and, therefore, could not help. The US was now in a difficult position. They knew that their troops, American soldiers, would fight Japan on land. It would be bloody, but they would have no other choice. To defeat a stubborn Japan, they would need to invade it. To make things worse, defeat is not an option. While the Soviets are recovering, they are also preparing for the next war. And if the US concedes, the Soviets swoop in and possibly invade the US to further expand their territory and their communist campaign. The silver lining for the US in this scenario is that they already had plans for a land invasion. They didn't just think about the matter now, they had a backup plan. The Japanese invasion was named Operation Downfall. It was planned that this operation took place before the 2 nuclear bombs were dropped. It was headed by American commanders Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz and Army General Douglas MacArthur. If the Manhattan Project failed and the fire bombings weren't enough to make the Japanese surrender, Operation Downfall would be the final option for the US. Operation Downfall consisted of 2 primary operations. The first would be Operation Olympic, scheduled on December 1, 1945. It would be the preliminary assault on the southern island of Kyushu. The next operation was Operation Coronet, the subsequent landing on Honshu scheduled for March 1, 1946. According to the US War Department, the casualties and bloodshed would be massive if Operation Downfall commenced. The US would suffer around 1.7 to 4 million casualties, including 400 to 800,000 US soldiers dead. They also estimated that a whopping 5 to 10 million Japanese would die in the operation. The effects of the Manhattan Project went beyond the conclusion of World War II. First of all, the success of the Manhattan Project ushered us into the nuclear age. If it had failed, the nuclear age would start much later, if it did. Of course, it would depend on whether or not a country other than the United States would succeed in developing it. Would we be ushered instead in 1949, when the Soviets successfully developed their own nuclear weapon? It is also possible that the United States not being successful in developing nuclear weapons would mean that the Soviets would not be successful. After all, the nuclear arms race started when the Manhattan Project succeeded. Its failure would tell a different outcome. The US and the Soviet Union are crucial players in how different our world would be had the Manhattan Project failed. Its success cemented the US status as not only a global superpower, but also the most powerful country in the world at that time, the only country that wielded the most destructive weapon in human history. If the project failed, the balance of power would be different today. This is where the Soviet Union comes in. After the Great War ended, a Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union started to develop. They were former allies against Hitler, But without a common enemy, the conflicting beliefs had torn their relationship. It was a struggle for power and territory between two global giants. Of course, it was called the Cold War for a reason. It didn't turn into an actual war that would have resulted in millions of casualties. And one of the reasons why it remained that way was because of the success of the Manhattan Project. The Soviets saw what the US's nuclear weapons could do to Japan. They didn't want to end up like them. Of course, like I said, the Soviets did develop their own nuclear weapon at some point, which would even the odds. But what would have happened if the Manhattan Project failed? The Soviets would be more aggressive, not having the picture of what happened to Japan in their minds. In fact, with this scenario ending in the US being weakened because of the prolonged war against Japan and not having nuclear weapons at their disposal, there was a real possibility that the Soviets would take their chances in an all-out war against the US. It is no secret that the success of the Manhattan Project came with an ethical dilemma. Many question whether it was right to develop a weapon that could wipe out hundreds of thousands of lives in a single explosion, especially considering that the two nuclear bombs also killed civilians on the ground. People also question the aftermath of the project, the nuclear arms race between the most powerful countries in the world. Imagine that these countries are competing against each other to get the most nuclear weapons, the same weapons that could mean the end of the world as we know it. People who defend it argue that it was necessary to end the war, and the bomb spared more lives than it ended, considering that its failure would mean a prolonged war and more casualties. They also cite the technological advancements that came with its success. We use nuclear energy now to power nuclear reactors that provide whole cities with electricity. If the project had failed, we would still rely heavily on fossil fuels, which have proven adverse environmental effects. It can cause air pollution, water pollution, and climate change. Besides nuclear energy, it also led to various advancements in medicine, including radiation therapies for cancer and the use of isotopes in imaging and diagnosis. Would we still have these advancements now? Maybe if another country eventually succeeds in developing nuclear weapons, or maybe not, if no nation figures it out. The Manhattan Project also played a role in inspiring efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and promote disarmament. The treaty aims to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and other weapons made by technology, to promote cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and to further achieve nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. If it had failed, this treaty and other peace agreements regarding the use of nuclear weapons would not exist, as these were the reaction to the bombings in Japan. It is also possible that the treaty would still exist today even if the project failed. Another country would succeed, or an attempt at developing weapons would evoke treaties like these anyway. At the end of the day, this video is only a discussion of the possibilities as to the Manhattan Project did succeed. On the other hand, it killed hundreds of thousands of lives, including civilians. It ushered us into the nuclear age, where the most powerful countries in the world measure their strength by their nuclear capabilities. Furthermore, it led to nuclear non-proliferation acts that produced relative peace among the nations. It also led to multiple scientific advancements that we enjoy and benefit from today. Wherever you stand on it, one thing is for sure. Had the Manhattan Project failed in 1945, the world would be much different than the one we know today.